Türkiye'den ve dünyanın farklı köşelerinden bizi izleyen değerli izleyiciler, herkese güzel ve sağlıklı bir akşam diliyorum. Bu akşam yeniden düşünmek,
We have a very special guest in our Rethinking, Reinterpreting program. His works of art has been translated to various languages throughout the world, a modern writer and a thinker, and he has a lot of international awards. So our guest is Mr. Amin Maalouf. This evening, we are going to create a link, a chain of thought, which will start from Ankara, and we will try to reach this chain of thought to Paris and all around the world. People of thinking would not enjoy consuming. People of thought produce thoughts, generate thoughts for the good of the people, and they multiply these thoughts. And today's journey of our mind would not be for consumption, but it will be for sharing our thoughts with the people and to multiply our thoughts with the people. So we start our journey of the mind. And we have a difference in the theme of our program. We are together with Mr. Amin Maalouf in Ankara, and we have Mr. Babi Taruf. And from Belgrade, we have Mr. Fahri Akdoğan, who are going to accompany us in this program. Hopefully, this will be a very good dialogue we will establish this evening. And this evening's program will be interpreted to Turkish, English, and Arabic simultaneously.
So, Mr. Amin Maalouf, we are honored to host you here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
I want to give you our warmest welcome from Ankara, from Turkey. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be in contact with you and share this this session of thinking together.
Thank you. If you are ready, we can start with the questions.
Yes, with pleasure.
Okay. Your readers seem to appreciate the frequent use of parables in your works. The way you tell stories is full of excursions that you take the reader on. My question is this a stylistic influence from Arabic?
You are certainly right. I think there are influences of my country of origin, my language, my mother tongue, and also all the things I have read throughout my life. But I think that a writer is not the best person to comment on what he has written, because I never think about the parables or about influences. When I engage in writing a book, my main preoccupation is how to tell the story, how to make the readers interested deeply in the story, how to make them relate to the story. I think these are the preoccupation when I am writing a book, and so I don't have this vision from outside on my book or on my work. I think this vision is much better felt by the readers.
Thank you. Maybe Turkish readers love the emotional tone of your unique perspective. As someone who has experienced both Eastern and Western mentality, do you think there is a difference in how societies approach emotionality?
I think there are differences between the perception from one society to another, but there is also a difference between the perception of one individual and another inside the same society. We are, as one historian put it, we are the sons of our time as much as the sons of our parents. So we relate to our time. We are influenced also by the surroundings. We are influenced by the language in which we write or we speak. We are influenced by gender, by age. I'm sure that I don't write the same things at 70 that I wrote at 30. You know, things change. The place where we live changes us a lot. The world in which we live changes us. So to answer more directly your question, I think there are differences between societies, but they're not more relevant than differences between individuals in every society.
Yeah, maybe Zeitgeist in German is important. What you say.
Absolutely, absolutely. It's a word I use sometimes, which is the spirit of the time. I think we are very much influenced, although it's not very obvious. We cannot say I am influenced in this way by the spirit of the time, but of course we are influenced. We relate, even if we don't feel it like that way. We are very close to all the people who are living today, whether they live in France, in Turkey, in Korea, in Japan, everywhere. We have much more in common than with our great-grandfather, for example. You know, if I meet my great-grandfather today, I don't have a lot to share with him because our references are so different. While if I meet with somebody who's in Korea and we can speak the same language, usually English, and we will find many things in common, and so this is what I would call the spirit of the time, Zeitgeist in German.
Yeah, spirit. Oh, thank you. In your comments on colonialism, you have mentioned Western societies' approach to ethics. Countries like the USA, Russia, or France that have created great perspectives on humanism, but don't represent this philosophy abroad, like in the Middle East or Africa. Somehow the standard changes. How can we explain this?
I think you're talking about many different things, because colonialism is a word that has all kind of meanings and has a very wide historical basis. I think one aspect of what you have said, and I completely agree with you, is that some societies speak about a number of principles that, and when one looks at the reality of the behavior, the principles are not always there. So either the principles are used as political tools, or the principles are just forgotten. That's I think an aspect which is very obvious today, which probably has always existed in the past, but today it's more obvious. As for colonialism, I think there are many aspects of what is colonialism, depending on the age. For example, the United States did not have colonies in the sense that France had colonies. Russia did not have colonies like France or England or Belgium had colonies. Russia expanded, but it expanded continentally. So it was not obvious that what was occupied were colonies. The United States, which was itself a colony, when it began to play a role, which is something very recent, in fact. The United States did not play an international role before the extreme end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Until then, it was a very marginal power. But the United States exerted influence in different parts of the world, but it didn't really have colonies in the sense that the French had colonies. And for some time, it was militant against the idea of colonization. Like at the end of the First World War, they wanted to give determination for all the peoples of the world. And so the attitude about colonialism has always been something very, very different. And there's also another aspect, which is the colonization by population, which is something, again, very different when a whole population settles in some country and tries to take over the country and make it a settlement place. And so, again, sorry for the length of the answer, but the idea of colonialism is a very, very wide idea which covered a lot of things.
Maybe my next question is, authors tend to be more detail-oriented and sometimes vague when making serious comments on delicate issues. You don't shy away from making explicit political comments. Your options are clear-cut and not so open to misunderstanding. Is this because of your prior career as a journalist?
Well, I value clarity very much. That's very true. I work a lot when you see a page I have written. You don't always know that I have spent weeks and weeks reading it again and changing one word here and one word there. I value very much clarity, especially in my essays. I try to express things really in a very calibrated way. At the same time, I don't like provocation. I don't try to create reactions. I just try first to understand. And I think it is an important and difficult task that we have throughout our lives, to understand the world in which we live. It's not very easy, but I think it is part of our mission as humans to understand the world and then try to explain it in a way that makes it more understandable, not less understandable. So we try to value and clarity and try to simplify a number of things without oversimplifying them, because the world is complex, yet it is understandable. The world is not opaque, it's not something full only of mysteries. I think the world is a rational reality if we look quietly and with serenity and try really with humility to understand what is happening, not only to try to find in the world what we want to find in it. just to understand how it is functioning. And I spend a lot of time in my everyday life trying to understand what happens in the world around me.
Thank you. Maybe we can say simplicity is aesthetic. Or this, my next question is one of our staples. You know about the story about of Moses. In 3 Abrahamic religions, there are this same story. He was the only one of the Israelites to not grow up amongst them and was not confined to their slavery. And he was the only one to save them. Do you think Moses could have saved the Israelites if he grew up in the environment of their people?
To be frank, I don't know a lot about Moses, but I've read a few things, and I noticed what many specialists say, that his name is not of Hebrew origin, but most probably of Egyptian pharaonic origin, like Thutmose or something like that. So there is a mystery about the personality of Moses. But your question, I think, is very interesting. It relates to the way people can overcome a certain situation. When you are completely drowned in a situation, it's very difficult to see beyond that situation. When you have the opportunity to be slightly above the situation, you can more easily see how to get out of it. I'm going to take you an example which is much closer to us, an example in modern politics. Because it struck me when I read it a number of years ago. You remember when President Carter was elected in the United States? He was a governor of Georgia, and I remember I read a few things at that time. There was a close advisor to Carter, whose name was Hamilton Jordan. I don't know if you remember his name. And he explained how Carter decided to run for president. You will see now why I'm telling this story. Hamilton Jordan, who was a close advisor, decided that Carter was too shy to go and run for president of the United States, because he had never played any national role. So he decided to invite every personality who came from Washington, presidents or former presidents or vice president, and present them to him so he could see that they are humans like him. They have their weaknesses, and that helped him go beyond the shyness of a local politician and decide to run for president of the United States. I'm telling this story because sometimes the person who has lived, for example, in a palace, who has known rulers, has an ability to see their weaknesses, sometimes to fight against them. Another example, but from the past, is Attila. Everybody knows the figure of Attila, who's a mythical figure in Europe. Few people know that Attila was raised in a in the Roman courts, he used to be very close to Roman aristocrats. So his conflict with Rome was a conflict of somebody who knew Rome from the interior. So that is what helped him at one point fight against the Roman Empire. So maybe I explain things through too many historical example, but I think I was inspired by your question. Somebody who lives outside a community has sometimes the possibility of seeing things that people who are in the community do not see.
Yes, in many books you read sometimes reality or historical facts mixed with fictions, and therefore it is important. And you said in an interview about your life when in Lebanon, it would be difficult, or it will be not the life what I lived today. It's
no, I mixed in my writings, in my novels mainly, fiction and reality. I do not really get inspired by my own life. Sometimes there are events of my life, events of which I had been a witness, that appear in my books, but what I speak about comes much more from my reading. As you may have noticed even during this interview, I'm very much interested in history. I read a lot about history, about all periods of history, antiquity, recent history, and all the things I read get their place in a way or another inside what I write, either in historical books or in novels or in old or essays. So you're right to say it's a mixture of what I observe, what I imagine, and I think in all what I have written in the last 40 years is a mixture of what I think, what I imagine, and what I observe around me or in the books.
Thank you very much. So, Mr. Tuna.
Merhaba.
Hello.
Alan?
Hello, Mr. Maalouf. Thank you very much for attending our program. If you allow me, I will continue in Turkish. I would like to thank our President, Mr. Şeref, for inviting me and allowing me to ask my questions to you. If you allow me, I will remind you of a very well-known anecdote, because our question will be relevant with this as well. As you know, it's a very well-known story. There's a scorpion who wants to cross a river, and in order to cross the river, the scorpion has to go on the back of the frog. But the frog is very worried because he thinks that the scorpion would bite him. And the scorpion gives him the guarantee. And then they go on the river, but midway, the scorpion cannot keep it to himself, and he bites the frog, and both of them drown. So in one of your writing.
İnsanoğlunun içinde var olan
You
kalıcı
talk about the
yaralardan
permanent
bahsediyorsunuz.
wounds inside the human
Ve
soul.
ben
And I
inanıyorum
do
ki bu kalıcı
believe that
yaraların
these
birçoğumuzun
permanent
içinde
wounds
var
do
olduğu bir
exist
gerçek.
in most of us. This is a reality.
İki farklı
So I
soru
would like to
çıkarmak
ask two
istiyorum buradan
questions, if you
müsaadenizle.
allow me.
Bu
These
kalıcı
permanent
yaraları
wounds,
dikkate
if we consider
aldığımızda
them,
insanlar
do you
arasında
think that
sağlıklı
in
bir
order
iletişim
to build
kurabilmek
a
için
healthy communication with
ne yapmamız
people,
gerekiyor? Bu
with
kalıcı
other
yaralarla
people,
böyle bir
how
ilişki
should we
kurmak
act? Is
mümkün
it
mü?
possible to
Bu
build
yaralar dururken
good
içimizde
communication when we
güven
have these
inşa
permanent wounds
etmek nasıl
inside? And
mümkün
how
olacak?
can we establish
Ve bununla
trust
bağlantılı bir
between us
sorum
when we
daha.
have these wounds?
Bazen
And
kalıcı
another question
yaralarımız
linked to
olmasa
this,
bile
although sometimes we don't have
bu
these permanent
kurbağa ve
wounds,
akrep
just like
hikayesinde
in the
olduğu
story
gibi
of the scorpion
bize
and the frog,
öğretilen
we have
hikayelerin
these
içimizde
taught stories
olmasa bile
which we
bazı
have
kalıcı
learned.
yaralar olduğu
Even though we
fikrine
don't have
kapılmamıza da
some
yol
wounds,
açabiliyor. Toplumsal
we might
hafızamızda
feel like we
biz
do due to
yaşamadığımız bazı
our
acıları da belki
memories.
yaşamışız gibi
We,
hissetmeye
due to our
başlıyoruz.
memories, we start
Bu
living
da
the pain
başka bir kalıcı
that
yaranın
we
açılmasına
actually
yol
do not have
açabiliyor.
ourselves, but someone else's
Bu
pain because
ikilemden
we
sizce
learned that pain.
çıkmanın bir
Do you
yolu
think
var
there's a
mı?
way out of this dilemma?
I think first that every writer and every human being has wounds, obviously. Some wounds are linked to personal life, to family life, and some others are linked to a wider problem which involves societies, communities, nations, and others. I tend to believe that wounds are assets for us. We need these wounds in order to feel life, to feel where we are in this world. And as a writer, I think nobody writes without wounds. I think if you have no wounds, you won't write. Sometimes I feel that the ink with which one writes is like the blood of a wound. You need to have a wound. It's not always obvious which wound, but there are wounds. That's a reality. And we have to make the best of it. We cannot live without wounds. We can take control of the wounds in a way and use them to promote our life, to improve our life. Now, you have alluded to wounds that exist and which history has registered. Of course, we all have also this kind of wounds. We have stories that we were told by our parents, by our ancestors, or sometimes stories that we live ourselves, which tend to explain to us that these people who are our neighbors, it's very difficult to trust them, like the scorpion of the story, and we have to be always on our guard. Well, it is a reality also of this world. And again here, we have to overcome that, not ignore it. I think one cannot ignore. One has to be aware of the reality of history, the reality of the feelings of people. When somebody says, well, I am afraid of this situation, you cannot convince him that he's not afraid. You try to understand why he is afraid. You try to change sometimes the reality in order to calm his fear and to let him live without fear. So we are in a world where everybody has fears, and very often they are legitimate fears, even if sometimes they are exaggerated, sometimes they are even maybe invented, but there are there are legitimate fears, and the solution I have, very modestly, is try to understand. Try to understand mainly through history, to learn history, try to understand, and try to see if there are ways of overcoming the fear that we have.
Thank you very much
Çok teşekkür ediyorum.
for your answer. My next question will be also linked with literature. In the relations between the societies and communities, there is a hope for peace in the futures, and this hope always exists since centuries, and people are always thinking about it, thinking about how to establish this peace. But today, we know that one of the most important instruments in establishing peace is culture and cultural factors and elements. And when we consider this reality, during the process of establishing peace, how do you think we should make use of literature in establishing peace? And an author, do you think, when the author is going to write something about conflicting communities, how do you think the author should approach to this issue?
No, I think culture sometimes is a factor of peace, but not always. Very often one hears that these two nations, for example, they have so much in common, and but their interests are opposed. And I observe to myself that it might be the opposite. Sometimes their interests should bring them together, but their cultures oppose them. And there are real differences in culture, real oppositions in culture. I don't think we could say that culture is always a factor that brings people together. It could bring them together, but sometimes it does not bring them together. And the role of literature should be to bring people together, and on a very solid basis, not just by lying, by describing the world as if it were an idyllic place. No, there are real problems in the world. There are real conflicts. And we are not, to be honest, we are not going towards a world of peace and tranquility. It's not true. We are going toward a world which is violent, which is a world of wars and conflicts. So I think the role of writers today is to understand the world as it is, to try to describe it as it is in a very credible way, and think about the possibility of going out of this tragedy we are living in on many levels. So literature has a role, but it's not a simple role. It's not straightforward. It is a very complicated role, how to make people from different nations understand in depth the realities of the other, understand how they feel, what are the wounds, as you said, what are the wounds that they have. And so literature is important when one goes to the depth of things and doesn't remain on the in the shallow aspect of things.
Thank you very much. Then let's start with another question, which is again very much related with literature, if you allow me. You actually talked about history just now, and together with history there's literature which goes in parallel with history, but maybe between the two of you, or right in the middle of the two of them, there's another form, which is fairy tales, myths, or legends. And these also are very much linked with both history and literature. There's not an obvious link, but we do know that there is a relation between all of them. And in the societies, pre-modern times, we see that these types of stories have a great impact. Especially, we see that traditional storytelling has an important place in both Arabic and in Turkish cultures. And they are even lessons for educating the generations. So this is important both in terms of shaping the imagination of the new generations and also to inform the world as well. So this storytelling is a very important instrument in shaping these generations. So storytelling, in Turkish we call it meddah, the storyteller, and in Arabic it's meddah as well. It's a very important tradition. It was, let's say, an important tradition because it's almost becoming obsolete, unfortunately. So when we look at the new generations, we see that from fairy tales, from stories, from legends, they are totally detached from them. Today's generation, today's children are detached from these fairy tales and myths. Do you think in the near future this would have a repercussion? A child who grows up without hearing fairy tales, what type of a future world would that child build?
No, storytelling is important in every society, either Asian society or modern society. There is something in France that is called le roman national, which means the national novel. In fact, it's the way a nation tells its story. And I think every nation in the world needs a way to tell its story. Look at what's happening today in the United States. There is something being shattered in the way the story of the nation is told, because there were people who were marginalized during the story, and now they are saying, well, we did not have our share in that story, and there are people in that story to whom and a very big importance has been given, and we contest their importance in the national story. And I think this is very true of every nation. Take my country of origin, Lebanon. One of the problems is that there is not one national story which is told by everybody. Every community has, in fact, its own story of what happened in the past, and you cannot build a nation unless you have, in a way, a common story that tells why this nation exists. And so everybody needs a story. I'm not sure it's only writers who can tell the story through literature, but it is an important aspect. And I think that is one of the reasons why literature is very important, because for a nation, either today or in the past, we need to tell the story of the people to whom we relate. We need to tell a story which is not exactly the story that was told 200 years ago, but we need a story which take elements of what was told 200 years ago and adapted to the reality of today. So storytelling, in my view, is extremely important even today and in every society in the world.
Yes, thank you once again.
Teşekkür ediyoruz tekrar.
The story of the past and retelling the stories of the past should be our objective then. That's what we understand.
It is what we do not have to forget the past. Nobody can forget the past, and nobody should forget the past. And I think we need to be aware of the past in order to move forward. The memory of a society is very important. And for me, every element of the past should be known. It's not always inspiring. It's not always ideal. Sometimes it has to be known, to be criticized and overcome. But it's never a solution to ignore the past.
Yes. All right, then let's ask another question, another question which is linked with both history and literature. Especially social historians in the recent times have been saying that the Middle Eastern cultures, especially since the 19th century, experienced a Europeanization process, becoming European, Westernization process, and it had an adverse impact on the Middle Eastern culture. They're debating this. And this Westernization process since the 19th century, unfortunately, resulted in an unsuccessful, let's say, mimicking of their culture. And this has an impact on the uniqueness of our cultures and also what makes our cultures universal at the same time. So this had an impact on us losing this uniqueness and universality. So in this sense, do you think we can be rid of these impacts in the 21st century? And do you think we will be able to achieve a new voice, which is both unique and universal in this geography?
I think there was a dilemma for all non-Western societies, especially in the last 200 years. And every society had to deal with that dilemma. The Chinese society, the Japanese society, the Russian society, the Arab society, the Indian society, the Turkish society, of course. Everyone had a history of dealing with that model, which was proposed to the world, which was the Western model, which was proposed to the world. And the dilemma was how to take the modernity without losing our identity. And sometimes when you take the modernity in a certain way, you lose part of your identity. Sometimes when you refuse to take elements of modernity for the sake of preserving identity, you end up lagging behind and not being able to cope with the realities of the world. It is a very, very delicate balance, and nobody can get it just in one stroke. Look at the Chinese, for example. How many revolutions, how many upheavals there were with Sun Yat-sen and Mao Zedong, and now they have reached some kind of equilibrium in which they get the best of capitalism, and at the same time they maintain important elements of their culture. Others did not succeed as well. Now, the Middle East had more problems than other parts of the world, because contrary to China, which is a huge nation, to India, which is also huge, to Japan, which is an island, the Arab Islamic world was immediately in the vicinity of Europe. So the expansion of Europe came directly to that part of the world. It was very much divided, and it is still divided. So there was not one Chinese nation and one Japanese nation, or even Russian, capable of making its own experiments. There were all kinds of experiments in every part, sometimes in Turkey, sometimes in Egypt, sometimes elsewhere. And it was, and it still is, a very, very delicate problem to solve. And I must say that there were already huge problems when I began to open my eyes and get interested in what's happening. And I must admit that 50 or 60 years after, the problems are even bigger than what they were when I began to be interested. So how to develop, how to become powerful and advanced, how to get all the science of the world, how, and at the same time remain ourselves and develop something which we can really give the whole world, ideas, values that are really relevant to the world, which cannot only be elements of our own past or our own culture. We have to give things that are really valuable to all humankind. This is something which is not easy to have, easy to get, but this is the task of our generation and probably the task of the generations to come in all that part of the world.
Thank you very much, Mr. Maalouf. Now, if you allow me, I will ask my last question. Not me, but our colleague from Belgrade, Fahri Akdoğan, is going to ask the last question to you.
I cannot hear now. I don't know. I did not hear. Did you hear the translation?
No, sir,
Sorry.
the link. No, sir.
You didn't hear, huh? No. Okay.
So if you allow me, I will ask his question to you.
Okay.
You have a character, one of the main characters actually in your book, The Disoriented. And the Turkish name of the main character is Adem, and Adam. And there's Semiramis, who Adem falls in love with. And also, In the book, you are describing Lebanon in great detail, beautifully. So then, can we say that Semiramis symbolizes Lebanon in this in this novel? Because we see that this novel is filled with symbols. The names show us that, and also the flow of the story is very much filled with symbols. So, what could you tell us about the symbolism in this novel?
Certainly, the figures, the characters of the novel represent elements that are partly linked to my story, but not completely. For example, Adam is partly myself, although there are many elements of his biography which are different from me, but yet he is the one who carries my voice in the novel. Semiramis is the person who remained in the country while Adam left. So in a way, she is, and you're right, personification of the country. But the name itself, Semiramis, is a name that comes from Mesopotamia, and it is the name of a figure which was half mythical. Nobody knows exactly if it was a deity or a queen which became a deity, but she's at the same time a symbol of Lebanon and the people who remained there, and also the symbol of the whole area which is so ancient, which was the cradle of so many civilizations. And Semiramis is all of that. And at one point in the novel, there is a lady which comes through the novel very discreetly, an old lady which comes from Iraq. And it's also a way of linking Semiramis to the ancient history of that part of the world. And you know, I've always felt that part of the world, which is my home country, my home civilization, there is something very sad in it, because I feel that it made its history in a reverse way. We expect a country to move from backwardness to progress, from poverty to prosperity. And in that part of the world, the present day is probably one of the worst. And the more we go towards history, towards the 50 years, 100 years, 500 years, and thousands of years, and the more we discover that the place of that part of the world was more important, and it was the center of the world at some time. And of course, I dream that one day it will become once again, the center of the world in some way. But there is a sadness in me, and I think there is a sadness in everybody who loves this part of the world and observes all the dramas, all the tragedies that are happening in that part of the world.
Yes, thank you very much. So your last words I think that is felt as the common wound of everyone who has lived in this region, and we wholeheartedly agree with your hopes. And I leave the floor to Mr. Şeref Ateş for the last words. Yes, thank you very much. This was really a very beautiful conversation we had, and we have seen that languages, cultures, beliefs are coming around the same common ground. It did not block our journey of mind. And this evening, it was triggered from Ankara and it reached Paris and it reached all around the world. So we continued this excursion. And we are not saying as this is that. We are not dictating anything because all around the world, everybody can express their minds, express their thoughts, and that is only when we can work towards common humanity, and that is when we can make progress to establish peace. So in this sense, together with the pandemic, we have started this program, Rethinking, Reinterpreting, and we have seen what a necessity this program was. And through these programs, through these shows, we identified once again how necessary this was. So I would like to thank Mr. Amin Maalouf very much for his great contribution this evening, and hope to see you once again with new guests in the next weeks. I would like to give you the floor once again for if you have any last words, and then Mr. Fahri, he was disconnected, so we couldn't hear from him, and then we'll leave the floor to him, and then we will close the show. You have the floor, Mr. Amin Maalouf.
I just wanted to thank you for hosting me here, and as you said, it was a conversation from the heart, and we were all thinking together loudly and in a very, very friendly and I think very deep way. And I want to thank every person who took part in this very interesting meeting, and send all my greetings to the persons who will be watching it.
Thank you. Yes, Mr. Fahri? Fahri Bey. I think he is having connection issues once again. So on behalf of him, once again, we would like to wish all our viewers a good life and a good weekend. We hope you will all stay healthy and happy.
Thank you.
And
Thank you very much for everybody. Thank you.